Hi, this is History with me, Dan. In the mid-20th century, the city of Hartford, Connecticut went through an intense period of redevelopment. Entire neighborhoods were swept away and replaced with modern highways and modern elevated concrete complexes. One of the most dramatic transformations was when the city's old East Side neighborhood, centered along Front and Market Streets, not far from the Connecticut River, was completely demolished in the late 1950s and replaced with the massive Constitution Plaza and the neighboring Phoenix Boat Building. The neighborhood had a long history. In the early 19th century, it had been home to the city's elite businessmen and merchants, and also had a prominent African-American community that in 1826 established Hartford's oldest black church at the corner of Talcott and Market Streets. During the course of the 19th century, the neighborhood was home to waves of immigrants, and by the end of the century, many were arriving from Eastern and Southern Europe. It was a diverse neighborhood. In 1898, the city's first Chinese restaurant opened on the block of State Street between Market and Front Streets. By the time the old East Side was being demolished in the mid-20th century, the area was strongly associated with Italian Americans. Many people today still fondly recall the many Italian-owned businesses that flourished here, many of which, in the face of redevelopment, relocated to the city's south end. Particularly well remembered are the East Side's many Italian restaurants. I've talked a lot about some of these restaurants in my videos about the lost East Side, but they've been mixed in with a lot of other details about the neighborhood. In this video, though, I'll talk about Italian-American restaurants here in one place. I'll cover Pippie's and DePasquale's on Front Street, and on nearby Market Street, I'll talk about the Cloverleaf Cafe's La Rosa dining room and Mickey's Villanova restaurant, and the East Side origins of Frank's on State Street. So let's remember these lost Hartford landmarks in their heyday of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Starting with Front Street, our first restaurant is Pippie's, which was located at the corner of Front and Temple Streets. The restaurant opened as the Green Bottle Grill in 1934, where it was described as Jack Gordon's crowning masterpiece. Who was Jack Gordon? In the 1920s, John F., or Jack Gordon, was a self-trained artist who made models and displays for shop windows, fairs, and exhibitions, including prize-winning displays at the Hartford Automobile Show. He also worked for 11 years making stage designs for theaters in the Poli chain, including Hartford's Capitol Theater. With the end of Prohibition, he began specializing in the interior design of taverns and grills all over the city, sometimes finding his inspiration from stage sets he had created during his theatrical career. Just like the Green Bottle Grill, in their advertisements, these establishments trumpeted the fact that they had Jack Gordon designed interiors. Typically, he would take 8 days to decorate a tavern before handing it over to its proprietor. Gordon would then assist at the opening before moving on to his next project. As I said, Pippie's was first known as the Green Bottle Grill, and it kept this name until December 1940, when it switched its advertising to say Green Bottle Restaurant. Note that a full-course New Year's Eve dinner on December 31st, 1940 cost $1.25 per person. Within a few years, the restaurant was advertised as Pippie's Green Bottle Restaurant, and starting in 1945, when its new mural room for weddings, parties, and banquets opened, it was known just as Pippie's. Pippie, or Peppino, short for Joseph, was the nickname of owner Joseph J. Scotta, whose family had immigrated from Sicily. Note that the price for Thanksgiving dinner in 1957 was still only $2.50, and the famous blue plate was $1.75. By the late 50s, there was pressure from the city for redevelopment, and after a fire at the restaurant in May of 1958, Pippie's moved to a new home at the corner of Wethersfield Avenue and Airport Road, where it would continue until it finally closed in 1983. A little further down Front Street was DePasquale Sons Pizzeria and Restaurant. It had its origins in a bakery started by Biagio DePasquale, who was born in Bovino in the province of Foggia, Italy. He immigrated to the United States in 1905 and started the bakery a few years later. In 1917, he purchased the building at 541 Front Street. The bakery was on the first floor, while the family lived on the third floor in rooms once occupied by the parents of Sophie Tucker. In 1936, the family started a restaurant next to the bakery in the same building with an address of 545 Front Street. The restaurant soon took over the adjacent bakery, which was converted into another dining room, and a third room was created through an addition on the north. In 1945, the restaurant was again expanded with a new neon sign and a modern facade along the first floor that was extended even further north. The exterior featured classical statues, and inside was the elaborately decorated Pompeian room. The restaurant continued in business on Front Street, even as Constitution Plaza and the Phoenix Building were rising nearby. But it was torn down soon after. The area where the restaurant stood was along what is now the east side of the Morgan Street parking garage. The restaurant relocated to a banqueting facility on the Berlin Turnpike in Newington, which continued as DePasquale's into the 1970s before becoming Capra's. The building was torn down in the 90s and replaced by Circuit City, which is now P.C. Richard & Son. Returning to Hartford's Old East Side, let's move to Market Street and a place called the La Rosa Dining Room, which served Italian-American food and was operated by the Clover Leaf Cafe. This is a southward view down Market Street from the corner of Kinsley Street towards State Street. It was taken in the first decade of the 20th century before any of the businesses I'm about to talk about existed here yet. Today, loading docks for State House Square are on the right, and One Constitution Plaza is on the left. In 1933, the Clover Leaf Tavern was opened by Max Meyer on the west side of the street in the building at 65 Market Street at the corner of Kinsley Street. This tavern didn't require the services of Jack Gordon because it was moving into a space that was already lavishly decorated. An advertisement described it as the tavern with the marble bar and gold ceiling. The space had previously been the office of the De Sopo Bank, a private Italian-American bank that had closed in the wake of the stock market crash. In 1926, when the bank had first moved to this location, it had installed a new stone facade on the ground floor and had decorated the interior with a marble banking counter and an elaborate ceiling inlaid with gold leaf. The Clover Leaf Tavern would place a mahogany bar on top of the marble counter and adapt the space by adding booths. 4 years later, in 1937, the building was slated for demolition, so Max Meyer leased another building across the street at 52-60 Market Street. This had previously been the location of the Venetian Cafe, which was in business from 1908 to 1918. It had featured a sports ticker and a bowling alley. Meyer, who renamed the tavern the Cloverleaf Cafe, initially occupied half the building at numbers 58 to 60 Market Street. A few years later, in 1942, when the business was incorporated, its proprietor was Frank A. Phillips. He would expand the restaurant in 1945, taking over the entire first floor of the building, adding a new kitchen addition to the rear, and redecorating the entire space, which now featured the La Rosa dining room, operated by the Clover Cafe. It served Italian-American food and continued in business here until the redevelopment in the late 1950s and the construction of Constitution Plaza. Just a few doors to the south was a building called the Nolan, which was erected in 1902. In 1936, Michael Peretta and Michael Miano, both of whom were known as Mickey, opened Mickey's Grill in the building. 4 years later, they expanded the restaurant with the addition of the Villanova room, which was designed and outfitted by Harry Steinberg of New York, who planned a number of other restaurants in New England. Mickey Miano operated the restaurant for over 20 years. Born in Canicattini Bagni, Sicily, he came to the United States through Ellis Island when he was 6 years old. Growing up in the rough-and-tumble politics of Hartford's East Side, Miano gained influence as a vote-getter and deal-maker. Politicians and reporters were regulars at his restaurant. On a well-remembered night in 1944, members of 3 different political factions who had recently fought it out in tough municipal elections all showed up at Mickey's. Miano carefully seated them in different sections of the dining room, and after a few tense moments, one side offered to buy drinks for the other, and everyone was all smiles by the time they left. Meanwhile, a restaurant called The Empire, previously located on Trumbull Street, moved to Main Street opposite the municipal building in 1934. In 1945, Miano and his partners took over the Empire and moved the Villanova to join it on Main Street. The new restaurant, which combined the menus of both establishments, was called the Villanova Empire. The original Mickey's on Market Street continued as a separate restaurant and tap room, but the old Market Street Villanova room was dismantled and its murals put into storage. Many patrons wanted to have the murals back, so in 1946, Miano expanded the Villanova Empire by taking over the adjacent municipal cafeteria and creating a new room for the Villanova murals. Sadly, the Villanova Empire closed in 1948. New owners took over the place and reopened it later that year as the new Empire Restaurant, which specialized in seafood. As I mentioned, the original Mickey's continued on at 18 Market Street until it finally closed due to redevelopment in the late 1950s. Mickey Miano continued to be active in politics and also real estate from his office on Franklin Avenue until he passed away in 2002 at the age of 95. Just around the corner, a few steps west on State Street from Market Street, was a building that had once been Long's Hotel and later became the Hotel Oxford. This is where Frank's Restaurant, a longtime Hartford institution, first opened in 1933. Just 3 years later, Frank's had to move out when the hotel was slated for demolition. The restaurant moved to Asylum Street, and in 1944, owner Frank Lenti sold the business to Frank Parsaliti and Joseph Sapia, 2 childhood friends who decided to go into the restaurant business after hanging out at Mickey Miano's Villanova restaurant on Market Street. Frank's would continue over the years in 3 different buildings on Asylum Street until it finally closed in 1995. If you want to learn more about Frank's, check out my video on the left about Asylum Street before the XL Center. And if you want to learn about Hartford's 2 oldest restaurants, Hannes Oyster House and the Marble Pillar, check out the video on the right. But first, hit like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.